Good morning, Legacy Bible Church. It is Sunday morning, June 4th, and you're seeing me instead of our beautiful, wonderful Robin that's usually up here because she is out of town. And so I'm here to introduce Stephen's teaching, but what I wanted to say as the introduction is how excited I am to be here. And I was thinking about what to say this morning, and I just wanted to say that when I say I'm excited to be here, I truly am. This is the first time in my whole Christian life experience that I have a passion to get up in the morning and share when I come on Wednesdays or when I'm here this morning, because this is the first time that I have found truth and I have found freedom. And so I have a passion, not obligation. I don't feel obligated to come here and broadcast, but I have a passion because I want people to understand and realize what the scriptures teach. Not a new revelation that Stephen has come up with, but what the scriptures come alive and teach. And that's so different than just feeling like you're obligated to go door to door and tell people about Jesus so that they say a prayer so that they can go to heaven. And that's how I lived most of my life, is that obligation. And I don't feel that. I feel excitement and passion to share with you guys out there all across the world that the scriptures have so much more than what we've been taught. There's so much depth and freedom and life and excitement. I'm trying to think of all the descriptive words I could give you to what I have come to know about the Word of God and what it actually means. So I hope all that makes sense. Anyways, I'm here to introduce Stephen. I should have wrote down, he's going to do James 5, 1 through 6. If you haven't listened to the others, go ahead and jump right in, because I promise it will still make sense over time. And then you can always go back to our library and listen to the first part of James. So welcome. Thank you for being here. And here's Stephen.
Good morning, Legacy Bible Church. If you're listening, you are part of Legacy Bible Church. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to talk about something here to start that I wasn't planning on, but I said I haven't talked much about the work that I'm doing. All of it's in conjunction with Legacy Bible Church, but the seminary studies, I'm in a PhD program, third year PhD research program. And I want to talk a little bit about the work that I'm engaged in right now. I've got two books here. One of them is a fairly fresh translation. When I say fresh, I mean first time English translation of a very important writing from the 4th century. There was a big debate going on in the church, and I mean church broadly speaking, in the Roman Empire. And there were two major factions that were battling. And those two factions are represented in this little volume here. I'll say a few words about. And the factions that were battling it's really an evolution of what we talk about a lot here at Legacy Bible Church, especially in the teaching in James. It's an evolution of the same factions that evolved in those earliest years of the church, with the original kernel of truth, the ancient tradition of the apostles that emerged right on the heels of the empty grave, and then a secondary tradition that emerged at Jerusalem, where the Christian faith, was syncretized with Judaism, and it became what Paul called in his first letter, Galatians, the other gospel. And so those two traditions, what Paul held to, the gospel of Christ, and that Judaized partial gospel that he called the other euangelion, the other God, the heteros euangelion, or the other gospel, are the genesis of then a playing out of that same controversy for the first 3+ centuries of the church. And so here in this stage in my studies, I've worked through the 1st century and the 2nd century, and I've worked through the 3rd century. And I'm now in a phase of what I call landing the plane, right? With the first and second century, I got the plane up in the air. We're flying at 30,000 feet, talking about the controversy. And then through the course of the third century and the fourth century, the controversy that what had its genesis in this battle between James and Paul that you see in Galatians and James, is really the plane is landing, and it lands with Emperor Constantine. When Constantine puts his weight, his clout, his authority behind the progeny, if you will, the child that came out of the heteros euangelion from way back in the beginning, that evolved and became this certain tradition that is that had evolved into what would ultimately become so-called, they called themselves Catholic Orthodoxy. And when I say Catholic Orthodoxy, don't think Roman Catholic. Think Roman Catholic Orthodoxy in the broadest sense in terms of what the words mean. Catholic means universal. They call themselves Catholic because this is the tradition that they had been successful in largely spreading throughout the Roman Empire. And back during the days of the Roman Empire, they considered the Roman Empire the limits of the civilized inhabited world. And so if something was spread through the entire Roman Empire, they would say, believing that that it was a legitimate use of the terminology, that the limits of the civilized world went as far as the Roman Empire. So Catholic, when they call themselves Catholic, comes out, I'm going to get a little technical here just because I can. Catholic comes out of its compound word that's from the Greek word kata, which means according to, and halos, which means the whole. And so katahalos means according to the whole. And when you put those two together, you get a word that from which we get Catholic. So Catholic is actually a transliteration of katahalos, which means according to the whole. And so it kind of has the context in terms of the lexical meaning of the word universal. It's everywhere. And so this tradition that evolved out of the other euangelion that became the predominant tradition practiced throughout the Roman Empire, they called themselves Catholic for that reason. And then Orthodox means correct teaching. And in those, in that phase of the church, when this heteros euangelion was spread through the entire Roman Empire, they claimed, as often, how often have you heard today that if somebody is successful in a Christian family, successful in life, they have a nice house, plenty of money, yada, yada, they're really blessed. How many times have you heard, oh, the favor of God is on them? Like if you don't have a lot of money and you don't have a lot of material things, the favor of God must not be on you. I've heard that too often in the church, that when somebody has the appearance of success financially, economically, that's attributed to the favor of God. That's not true. God doesn't care how much money you have. And I'm not saying God can't help convict you in your heart to use your resources, whether you're rich or not, to use the things that are yours for certain causes. That's very clear in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9, that the Thessalonians became very generous toward the church at Jerusalem with their monetary offering because it had been placed on their heart. So anyway, back to the 3rd, 4th century, this idea of orthodox, which means correct teaching. They felt like this other that what had evolved out of the other euangelion that spread through the Roman Empire, and so that they would call themselves Catholic in the context of universal. They felt like, just in the same context in a contemporary modern situation where somebody will say, oh, the favor of God must be on. Look how well they're doing. The favor of God's on them. They, in that same context, would say, well, this tradition that we have, that we hold to, that is now universal Catholic throughout the whole Roman Empire, must have the favor of God on it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be Catholic. We wouldn't be the predominant tradition throughout the whole Roman Empire. Therefore, we can also call ourselves Orthodox, correct teaching, because our tradition obviously has the favor of God on it. And so they became self-ascribed. They gave themselves the name over, and this happened over a period of centuries. It's not like they had a meeting and said, oh, let's call ourselves Catholic Orthodox. Over a period of centuries, it just became common in the vernacular of this evolution of the heteros evangelion into what would become self-ascribed as Catholic Orthodoxy. Happened over a period of time, but that's where Catholic comes from, kata halos, and that's where Orthodoxy, ortho means straight, and so it has the connotation of correct, and doxy is the word from which we get doctrine. So it can mean doctrine or teaching, so straight, correct doctrine or teaching. So Catholic Orthodox, kata halos, orthodox means universal, correct teaching. So this is the word they gave themselves. That's where Catholic Orthodox comes from. And of course, later, the Roman Catholic Church would use the word Catholic for themselves, and the Greek Orthodox Church would use the word Orthodox for themselves. And so today, two of the major traditions in Christianity are Roman Catholicism, using the word Catholic, and Greek Orthodoxy, using the word Orthodox. But that's goes back to the roots. So I'm in the 3rd century, 4th century now, really wanting to paint the picture of what happened in the 4th century that essentially pushed away the original tradition of Christianity, the primitive tradition that the apostles fostered at Jerusalem in the earliest years, and that Paul took as the euangelion, the gospel of Christ, and it became so part and parcel to his ministry to the apostles, to the Gentiles, the teaching that Paul took to the Gentiles, which his teaching is predominantly captured in Romans, which he calls my gospel. Paul calls Romans my good message, my euangelion, because it's his teaching about the euangelion of Christ. And so that's the original. Well, what's playing out through these first 3 centuries, these first 300 years of the church, is this struggle, this controversy that I call in my studies, I'm kind of landing on the term just because it was used in the ancient church, the Paschal controversy. Paschal just means Passover. Comes from the Greek word Pascha, which it's a transliteration of the Hebrew word. It means Passover, and it refers to the annual holy day of the Passover, which is on the Jewish calendar, first month of the year, the month of Nisan, and it's when the moon reaches its fullness in the month of Nisan, which is always on Nisan 15. So it's always just right at the mid-cycle, 28 days in a Jewish month. And so the first half is the moon going from dark to full, and the second half, the moon going from full to dark, and then you start a new month. So Nisan 15 is the evening when the moon rises on the horizon as a full moon. That's Nisan 15. That's Passover. And so the controversy became known as this struggle between two traditions became known as the Paschal controversy, because they made an issue, the other evangelion made a big issue out of the fact that we, the proto-Orthodox, later Catholic Orthodox, the child or the grandchild of the other evangelion, at Rome established their observance of the Passion Week on the Sunday after Passover. So that's why even today still remains the Sunday after Passover is the day that we take to observe what we call today Easter Sunday. They didn't call it Easter back in those days. They called it the Pascha. They called it the Pascha fast, or the Pascha feast, the Passover. They did not call it Easter. Easter is a word that happened, I think, all the way in the 8th or 9th century. It was the genesis of the word Easter, and it has the context of light, the light. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that. So it is the Pascha, the Paschal controversy, the Passover controversy that I write about in my research. I'm studying it, reading about it, read anything I can get my hands on to particularly in the ancient sources, where the ancient church fathers are writing about it in real time. And so I can read about it and get a real sense through reading a lot of the ancient sources about it. I can get a good sense on what's playing out there, not based on what somebody says about it in the 19th or 20th century, but all the way back, reading what the church fathers were writing is where you're really going to get a sense on what is going on in that day, in those particular years. So I've worked through the 1st century, the 2nd century, the 3rd century. I'm now landing this great big 747 airliner that was up in the air with the 2nd century and has been coming down. And when I say landing, I'm saying coming to the end of the history of the Paschal controversy, the Passover controversy, this struggle between two traditions. It did come to an end. And it came to an end not entirely with Constantine when he became the emperor of the entire Roman Empire in 324. And then you have the Council of Nicaea in 325. Most of you have heard of the Nicene Council in 325, where the so-called Nicene Creed came out of. And that was called by Constantine. Constantine presided over the council. A lot of people don't know that the Roman emperor presided over the Nicene Council. And the Roman emperor made the decision on the important doctrinal points of theology that were being established at the Nicene Council between these two competing groups that have their roots going all the way back into the same controversy that we've been talking about here for 6 months now between James and Paul. This is still an evolution of that. These two factions came to the Nicene Council, presided over by the bishop, presided over by the emperor. These are all bishops from around the Roman Empire. From all across the Roman Empire, came to Nicaea, which is very close to modern day Istanbul in Turkey. Nicaea is very close to Istanbul. And this is where the bishops from all around the Roman Empire assembled under the presidency that presided over by Constantine. And they had debates about theological issues and liturgical issues, how to do church life, et cetera, et cetera. And they made some important decisions. Well, here's one of the most important decisions that came out of the council at Nicaea in 325. That was presided over by the Roman emperor, not the Christian. Now, Constantine was a Christian, but he wasn't a leader in the Christian church. He was arguably a neophyte in the faith. He's not a theologian. He's a general. He's a warrior. He made his fame and name by fighting and winning major battles, by killing the enemy, and also a lot of inner wars inside the empire with his fellow generals that he battled with and had wars against. And the reason he became the emperor over the entire Roman Empire is because he defeated a general by the name of emperor, the Eastern emperor by the name of Licinius in 324. In September of 324, he defeated the Eastern emperor Constantine was the Western emperor, and that made Constantine in September of 324 emperor over the entire Roman Empire. And so it was the first time in probably almost 50 years that the entire Roman Empire was ruled by one emperor. And he happened to be the first Christian emperor. But again, he's a neophyte. He's in no position to be a leader over the church. But he was, and he presided over this council at Nicaea just not even a year after he established himself as the emperor over the whole Roman Empire. And one of the things that came out of Nicaea, here's where I'm going with all this. I want you to kind of see the big picture here. When I say here's where the plane landed. Now, when the plane lands, it's still on the runway. You know, it's got another mile or two before it comes to a stop. And so that you could say that about the Paschal controversy. I'm going to give you the event that really constitute what I would call the plane that's been in the air for 3 centuries. This Paschal controversy is going to hit the ground. The flight's over. The Paschal controversy is coming to an end. And for the next 30 or 40 years, it'll still roll down the runway, but the controversy is essentially over. And the controversy ended by the Roman Emperor Constantine putting the weight, the clout of Roman power behind the so-called Catholic Orthodox tradition that was most prevalent around the empire. That's who Constantine put his weight behind. And he put his weight against the other tradition, the tradition that goes all the way back to the apostles, what Irenaeus in the 2nd century called the ancient tradition of the apostles, what Paul called the euangelion, the good message, the gospel of Christ. Constantine in 325 put his weight toward the other euangelion and put his weight, therefore, against the euangelion of Christ, which was still represented by a substantial community of churches, if you will, in Asia, the Anatolian Peninsula, modern day Turkey. Still had a very strong presence of faith communities that still adhered to what I call the 14 Nisan faith tradition. 14 Nisan because it gets back to the way Easter is celebrated. The Catholic Orthodox tradition established their observance of Passover on the first Sunday after the Jewish Passover day. And so it would be on the same day every year, first Sunday after Passover. It wasn't determined by any day of the month as it had in the past. The 14 Nisan tradition, the tradition that goes all the way back to the apostles and that the apostle Paul taught and held to, what I call the 14 Nisan tradition, they observed the Passion Week on the day of the crucifixion. So Passover is on Nisan 15 on the Jewish calendar, and that places the day of the crucifixion on the day before Nisan 15, which is Nisan 14, the 14th of Nisan. That's the day on which Jesus was crucified. And that's also the day, because their days, the Jewish day goes from sunset to sunset. It's not morning to morning like it is in the Greco-Roman days. But the Jewish days began and ended with the setting of the sun. And so because of that, the Lord's Supper on the evening before the crucifixion was also on Nisan 14. So on the evening before the crucifixion, Jesus called the dinner meal in the book of John is called the Deipnon, the dinner meal in the upper room. And that was on the evening where Nisan 14 had just started. They had the Last Supper in the upper room. And then Jesus had the night of praying on Gethsemane, walk across the Kidron Valley and up on the Mount of Olives, and had his night of prayer there on the night of Nisan 14, when Judas led the chief priests out of Jerusalem to the Mount of Olives to arrest Jesus. That's all on Nisan 14. Jesus is brought into Jerusalem. He's tried before the chief priests. He's tried before Pilate. He even appears before Herod Antipas, who happened to be in town in Jerusalem because of the Passover. And Jesus was condemned, taken outside the city gates on that afternoon, and he was nailed to a cross and crucified. All of that on Nisan 14. That all needed to be accomplished and done before the start of the Passover day, which started that evening when the sun set. And that evening, by the way, on that transition from Nisan 14 to the Passover, Nisan 15, in Jerusalem, as that evening, as the day transitioned to the Passover day, guess what rose on the horizon? Any guesses? A blood red lunar eclipse rose over the horizon as observed from Jerusalem. Right? Lunar eclipses are such that they're observed differently depending on where you're at on the earth. But on that particular transition from Nisan 14 to 15, we're in the evening, call it 6 o'clock-ish in the evening, when the full moon is rising over the horizon. It's a blood red full moon. And what's one of the most fascinating things, church, is that we can actually use astronomy, the science of astronomy, to go back and map that back. Because, right, the stars and the moon and the planets are like a big clock in the sky. And that clock can actually be scientifically rewound to go back and place events and know exactly what day events happened on us. So based on astronomy, here's what we can know. That day of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, Nisan 14, would be that afternoon when he was placed on the cross and crucified and died, would be in our calendar, April the 3rd in the year AD 33. So I call the most ancient tradition the Nisan 14 tradition, because that day, the day of crucifixion, is and was the holy day that was observed by that most original ancient Christian tradition. They did not focus on, make their primary observance on the day after, or 3 days after the crucifixion, the resurrection. That would be done. That day would become the primary day of observance for the other tradition that would eventually come to call themselves Catholic Orthodoxy, that would observe and call it eventually, by the 8th, 9th century, they would call it the Easter day, which we still call Easter today, the first Sunday after the Jewish Passover day every year. But the most ancient tradition was called the Nisan 14 tradition because they observed the Passion Week. Their primary day of observance was the day of the Lord's Supper and his crucifixion. Why? Because that's the primary emphasis, if you will, the typology, if you will. It's actually not typology. It's actually the crucifixion is what we participate in and share in when we participate in God's salvation plan in the end purpose of his salvation plan. We share in the suffering of Jesus Christ, as Paul would say in Romans 6:5, if we become united ones in the likeness of his death, right? That's pointing to the crucifixion. Then surely we shall be of his resurrection. This is all about the end purpose of God's salvation plan. And so our role, our obedience from faith, is to become united ones in the likeness of his death. His death on what? On Nisan 14, on the day of his crucifixion. And so the Easter observance of the most ancient tradition was on Nisan 14. So you have these two traditions that are distinctly different. One observing the Passion Week with a focus on observing the day of the crucifixion. And then the other, Evangelion, that's basically a progeny out of that Judaized Christianity that's represented in the book of James. They would celebrate, observe the Easter Passion Week on Sunday after Nisan 15. You had two different ways of observing the Passion Week, two different traditions. And so they, in talking about the ancient controversy, I hope you're staying with me through all this. This is some good history you're getting here. In talking about the controversy that they were engaged in, they had to give a name to it. What do we call it? How do we talk about this struggle between two faith traditions? And they landed on the fact that the day of celebration of the Passion Week was different for the two traditions. And so they called it the Paschal controversy, the Passover controversy, because it was a controversy between two traditions that observed the Passion Week differently and with very different theologies and ideas and liturgies and worship practices undergirding their tradition. And so the ancient tradition, observing Passion Week on Nisan 14, because that is relating to the end purpose of God's salvation plan. The dying to self, according to the obedience from faith into spiritually spoken worship. And then the other tradition that would eventually become Catholic Orthodoxy, that celebrating Easter on the Sunday after Passover. So this is the Paschal controversy. Victor at the end of Bishop Victor of Rome at the end of the 2nd century attempted to just issue a command, a decree to all the churches in the Roman Empire that you will, all of you, doesn't matter who you are, if you call yourself Christian, you're going to observe the Passion Week the way we do here at Rome. You're going to observe our Easter, if you will, Paschal, Passover tradition. And it's called the Edict of Victor, the bishop, the Pope at Rome, issued this edict in 190, in AD 190. It ended up not working because as a bishop, he didn't have the clout, if you will, to make this happen in churches that were passionate, particularly the churches in Asia that were passionate for the other tradition, the 14 Nisan tradition. The bishop at Rome did not have the clout to make them transition to their Easter way of observing the Passion Week. And so it rode like that for another 100, almost 150 years through the end of the 2nd century, all through the 3rd century, beginning of the 4th century. Still had these two traditions that were living in a tension between the two of them. They always had a tension between the two of them because they had different theologies about the faith. So then we come into this age of Constantine, the first Christian emperor. And Constantine, out of the Council of Nicaea in AD 325, where he called all the bishops around the empire to come to Nicaea, and he presided over it. And Constantine, decided that one of the things that's going to come out of the Nicene Council, with all the bishops from around the empire assembled there, is we're going to once and for all resolve the Paschal controversy. And Constantine decided in favor of the tradition of Rome, the tradition that just 135 years earlier, Bishop or Pope Victor of Rome tried to do through his edict. Didn't work. He didn't have enough clout. Constantine was able to do. And so we have a letter issued by Constantine under the name of Constantine called On Keeping the Pascha. It's known in a lot of circles because Passover, is now associated with the name Easter. The letter is called On Keeping the Easter. The letter from Constantine is actually called On Keeping the Pascha, On Keeping the Passover. But if you Googled it, you might have more success Googling On Keeping the Pascha from Emperor Constantine. You can read his letter. And I think it's very likely that this letter from Constantine has a lot of the same language and characteristics of the letter that Victor had sent out 135 years earlier. And that it was probably the influence of the church at Rome that assisted Constantine, who, again, he was a neophyte in the faith. He wouldn't have the expertise to write a letter like this. Bishops had to do that for him. And so it's probably bishops out of the tradition at Rome that had the experience of Pope Victor or Bishop Victor of Rome issuing the edict in AD 190 that failed. Well, now we have Constantine to back us up. Here's the letter, Your Honor, Constantine. Here's the letter that we'd like you to put out under your name. Might be some differences, but you can read in that letter how, with the weight of the emperor behind it, the vitriolic, really anti-Semitic, it's quite an anti-Semitic letter, because the 14 Nisan tradition, the ancient tradition of the apostles, was accused by the other tradition as clinging to Jewish roots, because they based their annual chronology for the Passion celebration was still steeped in the Jewish calendar on Nisan 14. So they were accused of basically clinging to Jewish tradition when that wasn't the case at all. They just happened to use the Jewish calendar to identify the day, Nisan 14, as the day of the crucifixion that they were going to observe. So with Constantine putting his weight behind the Catholic Orthodox tradition that had in the earliest days been championed by the Church at Rome, was now the predominant tradition around the Roman Empire. Constantine is putting his weight behind Catholic Orthodoxy. And in this letter that goes out on the heels of his council at Nicaea in 325 called On Keeping the Pascha, he throws all of his weight behind Catholic Orthodoxy and essentially begins the final process, right? The plane's now landed and it's on the final runway to slow down and come to a stop. He has set the stake in the ground that is going to become the end of the 14 Nisan tradition as a vibrant, still being practiced, still visible, still church leaders, still going to conferences and still having a voice in the world of Christianity. You're going to see over the next 30, 40 years, their voice become almost zero, disappeared from the church, from the face of the church. Now, God says he keeps a remnant. He did in the ancient days of Elijah. You remember that Elijah thought he was the only one still clinging to the word of God. And God said, no. I still have 7,000, a remnant of 7,000 that have not bent the knee to Baal. And so I believe that God has always kept a remnant of the ancient tradition. They just haven't had a voice in the visible church. They've been basically in the background and silent. This is our ministry at Legacy Bible Church, is to restore the voice of that most ancient tradition that held as the primary thing in the faith. In fact, the only thing in the faith. God gives you faith to believe. He wants one thing. He wants worship. He wants worship the way he wants to be worshiped, worship in spirit and truth, which is church only in the dying to self and entering into that spiritual union with Jesus Christ. So this is, I'm in those last years here. This is a writing here of one of the primary leaders of Catholic Orthodoxy in the early 4th century. His name was Eusebius. He was the bishop of Caesarea, which is in Palestine on the coast, very close to Joppa, if many of you are familiar with that name, Joppa, in Israel. Caesarea is very close to Joppa, if you want to put a location to it. Well, Eusebius was the bishop of Caesarea, and he was a very prominent writer, a historian, church historian, all with a bias toward Catholic Orthodoxy. And Eusebius had a very strong bias against the 14 Nisan churches. And so what I have here is the writings of Eusebius, who in the 330, roughly 336, 337, 338, in those years, he wrote 2 major treatises that would end up becoming the final death knells, if you will, on the 14 Nisan tradition. They're called Against Marcellus. Marcellus was the bishop of the church in Ankara. That's in the middle of the Anatolian tradition, peninsula, in that final stronghold of the 14 Nisan churches. Marcellus was the leader of that last remnant of the 14 Nisan churches that still had an active voice. And Marcellus was a very active leader in those days. He was active at the Council of Nicaea, and wasn't very happy about a lot of the outcomes at Nicaea. But so what you have here is the writings of Eusebius, who's writing against Marcellus. And it's only published in an English translation in 2017 by a woman by the name of Kelly Sparrow. She's a patristic scholar, and she did what nobody has done before her, which is to take this great text here of this final stages of this Paschal controversy, where Eusebius is arguing against Marcellus, and she has translated into English. And so I use that, and I also have, if you will, the Greek text from a gentleman that I've come to know, a scholar who is a German who taught at King's College in London. His name is Marcus Vincent. He has a book with the Greek text of this writing. And so between the two, I've made a major study out of what is Eusebius arguing there? What what was Marcellus still saying? Because Eusebius quotes Marcellus a lot. So you can see what Eusebius believes and his theology, and you can see what Marcellus believed and his theology. They're in the mid 4th century, in the middle of that decade, the 330s, about 10 years after the Council of Nicaea. So very interesting, very fascinating to learn about the theologies that are being represented by these two traditions, and mostly to be able to see by the most prominent leader of the 14 Nisan churches in Asia, how is he representing the faith? How is he talking about the faith? It's fascinating. This is the phase of the study that I'm involved in right now, and it's exciting. It's hard. It's so you've got to grind through all this material to really apprehend and to kind of open the eyes to what are they saying? How is this controversy playing out now in these very last stages, where you have the one last spokesman of the 14 Nisan tradition still speaking and still writing, and we can see what he had to say. And so that's not been brought out, that's not been represented in patristic scholarship, and that's the focus of my work, not just there in the 4th century, but going all the way back to the beginning, just part and parcel to the teaching that we're doing here in James. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. I think that's for the historical perspective, that is. I'm still going to talk on James here today. And I'm going to try and move fast. How far are we into it, Sarah?
45 minutes.
Okay. I'm going to try and move through this section fast, but not going too fast. I would like to land it maybe with about 30 minutes of teaching here on this passage in James. So last week we began in the last discontinuity passage in the book of James. You recall James has a very tight structure. It's a very sophisticated piece of literature where he's transitioning from continuity to discontinuity, continuity to discontinuity. And those of you that have been with me for many weeks of this teaching know that by those terms, I'm talking about James. His literary agenda is that the new covenant is continuous with the old covenant. The new covenant does not sunset Moses. The new covenant faith in Jesus Christ is to make you better doers of the law of Moses. That's the Jamesian theology tradition that Paul called the other euangelion. That's what James is representing in the book of James. So when I use the term continuity, that's what I'm talking about. That would be a passage where James is really focusing on and encouraging and exhorting this continuity with the law of Moses, that faith in Jesus Christ is for the purpose of making you better doers of the law of Moses. Why? Because that's where your salvation is. In Jamesian theology, very akin to Jewish theology, your salvation was by doing works of the law so that you rack up credits to your salvation account to offset your sins, right? It's like a scales of justice, so that when you appear before the judge on the last day in the eschatological judgment, again, this is Jewish theology, and this is very much represented by James. When you appear before the judge on the last day, you want to make sure that your scales are really weighed down with works of the law and offset all your sins, so that in the final judgment, you will be judged righteous because you had enough works of the law, good works, to offset all your sins. That's the theology of salvation being represented in James. So a continuity passage is where he's encouraging all believers, all Christian believers, to become doers of the law of Moses, because that's where the soul is going to be saved on the last day. And discontinuity passages in the letter of James are where he then goes into condemnation mode against the Pauline mission to the Gentiles, because Paul is going into the diaspora teaching that Moses is finished. And so that's why I call those discontinuity passages, which James is extremely critical of, uses very harsh vitriolic language, always pointing to the Pauline mission. That's a discontinuity passage, because I call it that because that's representing Pauline theology. In Pauline theology, the old dispensation, law of Moses, is over, right? He writes in Romans 10:4 that Christ is the end of the law. And that as one proof text really sums up, in terms of the dispensational salvation plan of God, Pauline theology. In Pauline theology, Moses is over. It's now just Jesus, and Jesus in the context of the end purpose of God's salvation plan. That's where righteousness is. That's where salvation is. It is in the end purpose of God's salvation plan, where we become the true worshipers, worshiping in spirit and truth, what Paul calls spiritually spoken worship in Romans 12:1. That's the end purpose. That's the end of the law. That's where we attain to salvation, righteousness, not our righteousness, the righteousness of Jesus Christ. So very diametrically different theologies, Christian theologies about the faith. And discontinuity passages are where James is effectively pointing at the Pauline mission, saying, not only do you all have it wrong, but you're doing tremendous damage to the people of God by teaching them to forsake Moses, because that's where salvation is. A lot of people don't understand that about the book of James. And that's why I've meticulously now, I think we're into we're into about the 7th month where we've been focusing. I started last October. That's more than 7 months. Very meticulously walking through James, verse by verse, passage by passage. We're now at the beginning of chapter 5. I want you to have this strong sense of what is James arguing and how is he building his argument to where he's now coming to really a crescendo, if you will, in his letter, where he's really driving the final death knell against the Pauline mission. And you're going to hear today in this passage calling them murderers. Murderers. Because why? If you teach a believer or a Jew to forsake Moses, you're essentially condemning that person to death, because it's in doing works of the law of Moses that you rack up credits toward your salvation. So if you teach Paul, this is James, according to James, Paul, if you're going out teaching the faithful, including your brothers, the Jews, even if they don't have faith, if you're teaching them to forsake Moses and they hear you and they follow you, you've essentially murdered them. That's the crescendo. That's the denouement that he's reaching here in chapter 5, at the beginning of chapter 5, in this part 2 of the discontinuity passage. Last week I taught on chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. And this week, chapter 5, then, that finished chapter 4. Chapter 5 is a continuation of that same discontinuity passage. The church father I think it was in the 12th century, that separated the New Testament into chapters, made a mistake here. Should not have put a chapter separation here between verse 4:17 and verse 5:1, because they're part of the same condemnation passage, discontinuity passage. And it's really only when you follow the argument of James and can see how tight his structure is in his letter that you can see the tight correlation between chapter 4, verses 13 through 17, with chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. They're part of the same condemnation. So I call last week's teaching part 1 on this discontinuity passage. And this week, if you look on the title page, is part 2 of this discontinuity passage that we title Condemnation for Apostasy. Because in the Jamesian view of God's salvation plan, if you forsake Moses, particularly if you're a Jew like Paul and Barnabas, if you forsake Moses, you're heretics. That's apostasy. That's rejecting the salvation plan of God. And so this is titled, this passage, this discontinuity passage, I title Condemnation for Apostasy, because here, more than anywhere else in the letter, James is coming out. He's got his fists up and he's in full condemnation mode against the teaching of the Apostle Paul, who is teaching Christians, and most particularly Jewish Christians, not to reject. He's teaching that Moses is finished, but James, in his language, is effectively saying you're teaching them to reject Moses. You can even see that in Acts chapter 21. I think it's in verse 21, where 8 years later, after the writing of James and Galatians, right, Paul goes back to Rome after he writes Romans. He has the offering from the Gentiles, and the first thing he does is go to see James, because James is the leader of the church at Jerusalem. And what does James do? He criticizes Paul, right? He says it right there in Acts chapter 21. says, you're going out into the diaspora and you're teaching the Jews to forsake Moses, and you're teaching fathers not to circumcise their sons on the 8th day. And what does James do? He sends them to the temple to undergo purification rites. And those purification rites are for rededication to the law of Moses, by the way. So this is James. James is passionate about the law of Moses, and James believes that faith in Jesus Christ has one primary purpose, and that's to make people better doers of the law of Moses. That's been the theme throughout the letter of James. I've taught about it. You can go back and start at the beginning and just follow the progression through the first 4 chapters. And that's the theme that James is developing in his letter. I call this letter from James. It's a fascinating letter, very sophisticated, very structured letter to argue what James is arguing here in favor of the continuity between the old covenant law of Moses, new covenant faith in Jesus Christ, continuous. Jesus Christ is making us, in Jamesian view, better doers of the law. So Paul's the enemy here, right? He has just started when James wrote in AD 48. James had just returned from his first mission trip to Galatia, where he is teaching this gospel of grace and teaching that salvation, not only is it not in Moses, it never was. Moses never was effective for salvation, Paul is teaching. And the Jews were always under a deception in that regard. They thought that, well, God gave us the law, therefore we can do the law of Moses, and God will be happy with us, and that'll be affected toward our salvation. That was always a deception. And so the purpose of faith is to open eyes to that deception, to know that the law of Moses was always just to shine a light on sin, that it's Jesus Christ, his righteousness, that saves, and only Jesus Christ, not Moses. Moses can never save. So Paul has just returned from Galatia, teaching that in AD 47. And of course, the Jews stoned Paul for that at Lystra, drug him outside the city gates, left him for dead. And now here in AD 48, James, the leader of the church at Jerusalem, fearing persecution, the same persecution that caused them to stone Paul, writes a letter in support of the law of Moses, so that the Jews will look at James and the church at Jerusalem, and James in his leadership role over the Christian faith communities in the synagogues in the diaspora. They would look at James, maybe a weird sect in Judaism, but at least they would look at him as an ally in the context of Moses, that, well, maybe they have some weird ideas about the Messiah and whatnot, but at least they're passionate about keeping the law of Moses. And if you're passionate about keeping the law of Moses, then you can stay in good stead with us, so the chief priests would say. So James is writing the book of letter. I believe it's very clear, especially when you read Paul's first letter, Galatians, where he's responding to James. And Paul calls James the purveyor here of the other euangelion, calls it the other euangelion. And he talks about there in chapter 6, almost at the end of his letter to the Galatians, he talks about the fact that it's fear of persecution that's driving this passion to stay connected to circumcision, to stay connected to Moses. It was fear of persecution. So based on that comment at the end of Galatians, we can know that if we believe Paul, we can know that it's really fear of persecution that drove this syncretization of the Christian faith with the law of Moses. Fear of persecution. And indeed, as was demonstrated at Lystra with Paul, you could find a quick death if you are a Jew and are holding to some notion that would be perceived as forsaking Moses. You get stoned for that. So let's bring up, if you would, the first passage there, and I'm going to read it. I highly encourage you to listen to last week's teaching if you haven't. It's the prelude to this. It's very important that you understand what happened at the end of chapter 4. But for time's sake, I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to start right in on chapter 5, verse 1, which is a continuation of that passage. So verse 1, "Come now, you rich ones, weep, crying out over the miseries that are coming upon you. Your wealth has decayed. Your clothes have become moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have been corroded, and their corrosion will be for a witness to you and will eat your flesh like fire. You stored up apostates in the last days. Behold, the wage of the workers, those mowing your fields, which is having been stolen, cries out away from you. And so the outcries of the harvesters have entered into the ears of the Lord of hosts. You delighted yourselves upon the earth and self-indulged. You fed your own hearts in the day of the slaughter. You condemned and murdered the righteous one who does not oppose you." Poking Paul's belly here with this passage. So "come now" is a repeat. That's an interjection. It's a repeat of the interjection that he started verse 4:13 with. Very rare. It's only used by James. He uses it 2 times, verse 4:13, now verse 5:1. It's one of the reasons you can know that there's such a tight connection between that final passage in chapter 4 and that first passage in chapter 5 belong together, connected together. From a literary perspective, that interjection is one of the things that demonstrates this tie, just based on lexicon and the literary aspect. "Come, you rich ones." Who are the rich ones? We've taught this over and over again, folks. This has been taught in the context of material wealth in the world, and that's wrong. That's a wrong way to teach this passage. You can do that. I mean, you can see the analogy. The Jewish teaching always has analogy between the physical and the spiritual. And so you can work through this passage and you can make it about material wealth and material rich ones, etc. But when you realize the context that James is pursuing, the theme, his thesis throughout his letter is about being keepers of the law of Moses, and those who don't keep the law of Moses, who reject Moses, are the enemy. And they're the, if you will, the antagonist. The protagonist is the good guy in a story. The antagonist is the bad guy in a story. So the protagonist here is the one who remains passionate about keeping the law of Moses. We'll see that especially in the final passage of the letter, verses 19 and 20. You're going to see James really put the protagonist up on a pedestal. He's the good guy. He's the one that's promoting keeping the law of Moses. The antagonist is Paul and those following Paul's teaching, who are teaching forsaking Moses. So the rich ones here have to do with faith. The primary focus here, and he even says it explicitly in chapter 2, referring to the rich in faith. So when James uses the term rich ones here and poor ones in the book of James, his primary focus, his primary thought consideration has to do with faith in Jesus Christ. Those who have strong faith have the faith to walk in the fullness of the salvation plan of God, which for Jamesian theology and tradition very much believed in and very much held to walking in that end purpose of God's salvation plan. He just had a very different idea about what it was for than the Apostle Paul did. In Jamesian theology, being a rich one, having strong faith to walk in the fullness of the salvation plan of God, what he called all the way back in chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, he called it the perseverance. That the perseverance is this end purpose of God's salvation plan. It's actually a term that certainly had It's Genesis in the primitive church, and Paul used the same term a lot in his own writing. It comes from cognate pair hupa mane, meno, if you will, compound word. Meno is used a lot, translated as abide in the book of John. Jesus says often, abide in me, et cetera, et cetera. That's the verb meno. So this word for perseverance has a prefix on it, hupa, which means under. So hupa meno has the context then of perseverance. And that relates very much to the idea of perseverance, to the idea of the Israelites, right? The Israelites, Yisrael. Sarah is the word that means to persevere. Sometimes it gets translated as to wrestle because of Jacob wrestling with God, but the actual Hebrew meaning of Sarah is to persevere. And so that's the context where the idea of the Israelite that came from the name given to Jacob when he wrestled with God, he persevered with God. And so those who hupa meno, persevere, is pointing to the new covenant Israelites, those who persevere with God. And that's why it's translated well as to persevere, all the way back in verses 1:3 and 1:4, and it'll get used again in the next major section here in chapter 5, this idea of perseverance. It's a New Testament vernacular term that relates directly to this end purpose of God's salvation plan. And so the rich ones that he's referring to here at the beginning of chapter 5, come now, you rich ones, he's pointing at Paul, who ostensibly are those who have strong faith to walk into the fullness of this end purpose of God's salvation plan and the perseverance. These are who he's referring to as the rich ones. It's almost being used tongue in cheek, because as you heard in the teaching last week, James is saying that those who are rich, ostensibly rich in the faith, but are teaching believers to forsake Moses, he said, if you are purporting to worship God in this end purpose of salvation plan, he said, you're sinning. That's the message all the way at the end of chapter 4 that then jumps right in to this current passage in chapter 5. So when he says that, if I can recall it, well, I'll just read it because I have it right here. Verse 4:17. Therefore, for the one knowing experientially the kalos, good thing to do, and then not doing the agathos, good thing, to do the kalos, good thing, is a sin to him. And you can go back and listen to the teaching last week, but the essence of this here is that if you are passionate about speaking in tongues, worshiping in spirit of truth, and yet you are rejecting Moses, you're forsaking Moses, you're not doing the law, then for you to do the kalos, good thing, for you to worship in spirit and truth is a sin to you. So then he jumps right into verse 5 here, and he's talking about the rich ones, the rich in faith who purport to have strong faith to be spiritual worshipers of God in this end purpose, the perseverance. Come now, you rich ones, weep, crying over the miseries that are coming upon you. What miseries? Well, he's referring here, James, to the miseries that they experienced in Galatia when they would tell a Jewish community to forsake Moses. They were kicked out, they were castigated, they were stoned. Paul was stoned. And so James is essentially saying, if you're going to go into the diaspora, into the Jewish synagogue communities, and this is going to be the message you teach, you're going to have, in a very quick way, in a very aggressive way, you're going to have miseries coming over you. And of course, Paul did all through his missions until he was ultimately jailed in AD 57 in Jerusalem at that event where he went to James, and James said, go get cleansed. And Paul went into the temple and started a riot, and he was in jail for the rest of his ministry, or for the rest of his life. in AD 57 till he was beheaded in Rome in AD 62. That's Paul's prison career. So these are the miseries that James is referring to, crying out over the miseries that are coming upon you. He's recognizing that you just got your you-know-what whipped in Galatia by the Jewish communities by going into their synagogues and teaching this apostasy, this heresy that you're teaching to teach the Jews to forsake Moses. It's not going to go well for you. You're going to have a lot of miseries. Verse 2, he says, your wealth has decayed. He calls you rich ones, right? Your rich ones referring to strong faith. James is saying here, you rich ones, think you're rich, worshiping in spirit and truth. Your wealth, he says, your faith has decayed. It's one of the reasons why you can say you purport to worship in spirit and truth, but for you, it's a sin because it's not leading you to do works of the law. So it's a sin for you to do that. So here he's talking about faith, you rich ones, and he says your wealth, your faith is corrupted, corroded, it's decaying. I hope you're seeing all this. And your clothes have become moth-eaten. That is a reference to being a Jew. To be a Jew is to be separated from the world. One of the things that separates you, the idea of a robe in Jewish parlance, the idea of a robe is to identify you as to who are you. Somebody should be able to look at you based on the robe you're wearing and say, oh, he belongs to this philosophical sect, or look at him and say, oh, that one's obviously a Jew. Look at the robe he's wearing. And so the idea here is if you are Paul, if you are forsaking Moses, yeah, it's bad enough for you, but you're actually teaching other Jews to forsake Moses. Your robe as a Jew, your identification as a Jew is moth-eaten. You have your clothes, your robe as a Jew, your identity as a Jew, which is always tied to doing works of the law, is moth-eaten. This is the imagery that James is creating here in this passage, this discontinuity passage where he is castigating Paul and those who would teach Christians, Gentiles, but especially the Jews in the synagogues and the diaspora to forsake Moses. Your identity as a Jew going out and teaching to forsake Moses is moth-eaten. Verse 3, back to riches here. Your gold and silver have been corroded. And here I believe he's talking about your gold and silver being wisdom. This is always in the letter of James, is always about gaining wisdom, which is wisdom according to Torah. Wisdom, knowledge to become better, good, faithful doers of Torah, the law. You go into the end purpose of God's salvation plan. We learned all the way back in the first passage. I think it's in verse 5. Does any of you lack wisdom? Petition God, the one who gives singularly, and for wisdom. And so this is the edification that comes out of that end purpose of God's salvation plan, is wisdom according to Torah, to be better doers of the law. And so here, your gold and silver, knowledge of Torah, your doctrine about Moses doing the law, and even your understanding, James would say, of the faith and what it's for, to become better followers or obedient to Moses and doers of the law, your gold and silver have been corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness to you as you go out and teach apostasy. It's going to be obvious that your gold and silver, your knowledge of Torah is corroded, is corrupted. And it's a witness to you when you go out and teach the Jews, your brother Jews, to forsake Moses. Your corroded wealth is going to be a witness to you. And will, now this is a future context here, and will eat your flesh like fire. So the first one is your riches, your gold and silver having been corroded, and the corrosion will be for a witness to you. That's present tense. That's today. This is what you're doing right now. But this last part here, and will eat your flesh like fire, is future tense, right? Jamesian theology, very much like Jewish theology, is always, in terms of salvation, is always looking to the last day. Eschatology, salvation's on the last day. When you go before the judge, right? He referred in chapter 4 to the judge and lawgiver. There's one. The lawgiver and judge is one. And he has that in view here with the future context here, involving fire and your flesh. This is James pointing to judgment on the last day. He said, you who forsake Moses, who are going to go before the judge, and your scales are going to look like this. Your sins are going to be completely weighing down your scales. You're going to have no works of the law to offset all your sins. And you just continue to add to your sins every day. You're going to go before the judge, and your flesh is going to be set on fire. This is what he's saying here. That's the future context of this part B of verse 3. You, and then here's the whole reason. Why? Why are you going to be judged? Well, you stored up apostates in the last days. What are the last days? The last days in Jamesian theology, and rightly in Pauline theology, and Johannine theology, the last days began with the empty grave. The last days are the new covenant age. That's what he's referring to here. You stored up, you're here in the new covenant age, and we should be teaching about the faith, which makes you better doers of the law, but you're teaching to forsake Moses. And so those who will be deceived by you, they're apostates. All you're storing up for judgment is not works of the law to credit to the salvation of your soul. All you're going to have to show on the last day are all the sins that you committed that caused your brother Jews to become apostates. That's Paul. That's what or those of you who are following Paul and teaching the same gospel that Paul's teaching, that's all you're storing up for the judgment day, for the future judgment day. All you're going to have to show for the future judgment day are the sins you committed and the apostates who also, like you, walked away from Moses. That's what you're storing up for the last day. Verse 4, behold, the wage of the workers, those mowing your fields, which is having been stolen. What's having been stolen? The wage of the workers is having been stolen, which is having been stolen, cries out away from you. We'll learn about that. What does that mean? Cries out away from you. And so the outcries of the harvesters have entered into the ears of the Lord of the hosts. Who are the harvesters? The harvesters are those who are approved ones of the Lord, who are passionate about doing works of the law, who are coming to the Lord in that perseverance, speaking in tongues, approved by the Lord. That's where judgment is going out. He's essentially saying here that the approved ones have the ears of the Lord. Judgment is happening there. Behold, back at verse 4, behold the wage of the workers. The wage of the workers. The workers are the doers of the law. That's the work we're talking about here. Doing works of the law. And what is the wage? The wage is that credit that goes to your account on the scales of justice and salvation, that you have a work of the law to counteract your sins. That's your wage. When you do a good work, what you get out of that is a credit to your account that on the last day will be determined by the judge, Jesus Christ, toward the salvation of your soul. We'll learn about that again ahead in verse 520. Behold the wage of the workers. The wage is the credit to your salvation account. The workers are doers of the law. Behold the wage of the workers. So he's saying, let's put into sight here the credits to salvation of the soul and the workers doing works of the law. Okay, keep that in sight here. Paul writes James, behold. And then he says, those mowing your fields. Now, fields are always, first off, in the physical realm, the fields has reference to the land promised to the Israelites. But in the spiritual sense, which is James' focus here, the fields are the people of God. These are the fields. And those mowing the fields, they're working the fields. They're taking a harvest out of the fields. Behold, those mowing, he says, your fields. Remember in chapter 4, the whole context in chapter 4 is this idea, this Jamesian idea that Paul is very arrogantly and very pridefully and very lustfully trying to create a following for himself. Behold the wage of the workers, those mowing your fields. And then he's back to the wage, which is having been stolen. The wages having been stolen cries out away from you. The context James has here is the stolen wages on account of those people of God who are being deceived to forsake Moses, thereby not doing works of the law, which is the wages. So their wages, when you're deceiving them and you are teaching them to forsake Moses, the wages from doing works of the law is being stolen. You're stealing it. And this cries out away from you. Away from you, it uses the ablative preposition apa, means away from, always has a context of a very explicit context of separation. So whereas Paul is operating in the worldly context, we'll hear this again just right in the next verse, where he talks about you delighted yourselves upon the earth and self-indulged. So when he talks about the outcries of the harvesters have entered into the ears of the Lord. And he, cries out away from you. The wage of the workers, those mowing your fields, which is having been stolen, cries out away from you. And so the outcries of the harvesters, those who are persevering with God, have entered into the ears of the Lord. A spiritually spoken worship, those unknowable utterances. That's what James is referring to here. Even though he has a very different idea than Paul does about those unknowable utterances, in Jamesian view, those unknowable utterances are always geared toward, always motivated toward making doers of the law and making better doers of the law. That's not Pauline theology. That's Jamesian theology. That's what's in view here. So if you're teaching the Jews and Gentiles don't ever become a follower of Moses, and teaching Jews to forsake Moses and don't have your sons circumcised on the 8th day, your infant sons, which circumcision is always carries the inference of doing the whole law of Moses. Saying the stolen wages of not doing works of the law is crying out against you, and the outcries of the harvesters, those unknowable utterances going up into the heavenlies, right? The context is separate. The heavenlies are brought into context here with the ears of the Lord, and referring to Paul then in the next passage or next verse on his operating in only in the earthly context. What Paul is doing and teaching is completely away from the involvement of the Lord and the ears of the Lord. But James is acknowledging that there are those who are approved who do have the ears of the Lord. So the outcries of the harvesters, those who are approved into the perseverance, have entered into the ears of the Lord. Verse 5, back into self-indulgence here on earth, where Paul and those following his teaching are arrogant, self-indulgent, selfish, and trying to create a following for themselves. This is Jamesian perspective here. You delighted yourselves upon the earth and self-indulged. You fed, this is an interesting one here, you fed your own hearts in the day of the slaughter. What's the day of the slaughter? The day of the slaughter is the perseverance, the dying to self, becoming united ones in the likeness of his death. That's the day of the slaughter. And he's saying, you fed your own hearts. You fed your own hearts. I mean, you're not getting edified from the Lord. You're not like all the way back in verses 1:4 and 1:5, where the perseverance is resulting in the Lord doing a perfect work in you. That's the edification. You're not getting any of that. This here, you're self-indulging. So it goes back here to recall in chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, where there are those three uses of the verb aiteo, which means to ask, or the better gloss or the better translation is to petition, because it's a very formal petitioning. When you're talking about praying to God, asking God, this is a very formal matter. And so petition is a better representation of that for that verb aiteo. But it's used three times there in verses 4, 2, and 3. The first and the third with the middle voice, which is reflexive, meaning you're requesting, but you're really just requesting from yourself. And then the middle one is a representation of what they're not doing, which is to request from God. And that's with the active voice. And that goes all the way back then to verse 1:4, where the aiteo is used the first time with the active voice, petitioning from God. Does any of you lack wisdom? Petition from God. The preposition is para there, from alongside God. Petition from God. So this calls all that into view here when he says, you fed your own hearts in the day of the slaughter. You're petitioning from yourselves, not from God. You have evil motivations, he said back in the early part of chapter 4. You petition wickedly with evil motivations. And so you're not petitioning from God. He uses the middle voice. Say you're just doing something there just in yourself, among yourselves. It got nothing to do with God. So he said, you fed your own hearts in the day of the slaughter. Your own hearts, he's saying again in chapter 4, your evil hearts, evil, wrong motivations. You fed your own hearts. You're not getting edified from the Lord. You're just feeding yourselves with your self-indulgence. It even says back in chapter 4 that you want to get these followers so you can feed on them. It says in chapter 4. So same context here. You fed your own hearts in the day of the slaughter. And then finally, verse 6, you condemned. This is almost right on par with verse 4:17, where he said to purport to worship in this end purpose of God's salvation plan is just you petitioning yourselves, and it's a sin to you. Your motivations are all wrong. They're evil. It's a sin to you. And so this is really correlating with that here in verse 5:6. You condemned and murdered the righteous one who does not oppose you. Recall in verse 1:6 or 4:6, verse 4:6, where James quotes directly from Proverbs 3:34. God opposes the proud, gives grace to the lowly. So the idea of God opposing the proud is it's the same verb here again in verse 5:6. God opposes the proud. We say, you condemned and murdered the righteous one who does not oppose you. Same verb as used in Proverbs 3:34 that James quoted. God opposes the proud. God opposes you, Paul. But he says there's some righteous ones, doers of the law, in the synagogue communities, in the diaspora that you're going out and teaching, and you're deceiving. Those who fall under your deception are not opposing you. And so for those who would not oppose you, who would listen to your teaching to forsake Moses, you have effectively murdered that one and condemned that one. Why? Because they're losing, by forsaking Moses, access to doing the law of Moses, which is the very thing that racks up those credits toward the salvation of the soul. Do you see all the connection here, church? It's such a tight argument throughout the entire letter. And every verse is just pregnant with meaning to James' literary agenda. So here in verse 5:6, he has just called Paul and those who teach like Paul, who would deceive the Jews and Gentile Christians, to forsake Moses and to not do works of the law, the very thing in Jamesian theology that credits toward the salvation of your soul. You wicked, deceitful, evil teachers of apostasy, you are murdering and condemning righteous Jews who, before they heard your teaching, they were doers of the law. Righteous how? Righteous by doing works of the law. You see how different this is than Pauline theology? Paul would say there's no righteousness except the dying to self, becoming spiritually united with the righteous one, Jesus Christ. That's the only place of righteousness. But in Jamesian theology, righteousness is those who are doing works of the law. Remember in chapter 3, verses 3:17 and 18, talks about the doing the karpos, the agathos good, karpos fruit of righteousness. In Jamesian theology, righteousness is from doing the agathos good, the objective good, which is doing works of the law. That's Jamesian theology. Again, diametrically opposite from Pauline theology. Their theologies are so different, church. You condemned and murdered the righteous one who does not oppose you, calling into view Proverbs 3:34. James could say, but God, the judge. And he says the judge and lawgiver, the one who's able to save and destroy the soul, calls into view that one here. He says, the righteous one who is deceived and will follow your teaching, whom you thusly murder, that one doesn't oppose you. He said, but I'll tell you what, Paul, I know one who does oppose you and who will oppose you. His name is Jesus Christ. He is the judge and the lawgiver, and he is the one who is able to save and destroy souls. That one will oppose you and does oppose you, says James. Okay, I am trying to do justice to James' letter here and represent what James is writing. It's a fascinating letter. It's an amazing piece of literature. And I want to be respectful and do all due diligence to fully represent what James is representing and what James is saying. As much as it is different than what Paul is teaching, which is what we hold to and should hold to, at the same time, if you're gonna, and here's the great thing about this, if you're going to fully understand Paul and what Paul is writing, it's very helpful to fully understand James and understand what James is writing, because if you understand the opposite side, the other side, you're going to better understand than what Paul is saying. So when James says that it's from works that the flesh is justified, you understand where it's coming from. That's where salvation is from doing works, salvation of the soul, from doing works. Versus Paul, who said, no flesh is justified from works of the law. Diametrically opposite. Okay, church, that is the end of this long discontinuity passage that I started last week with chapter 4, verses 13 to 17. Wraps up with the passage here, chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. Next week, I'm probably going to have to take a couple of weeks to do it. We're going into the final continuity passage of the letter from James, verses 5:7 through 5:16. That's a continuity passage where everything in that passage is James encouraging believers to walk in their faith toward the end of becoming better doers of the law of Moses. It's a continuity passage. We'll take a couple of weeks to talk about that starting next week. All right, church. I don't know about you, but I'm tired. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with me this long. We love you. We love the church. And our goal, our mission at Legacy Bible Church is to help the children of God to walk fully in their faith and become spiritual worshipers of our Lord Jesus Christ. That's our passion here at Legacy Bible Church. So hopefully we'll see you Wednesday with a live and unscripted with Sarah. And I think I'll be back next Sunday. We'll see how it goes. All right. We'll see you then. Take care, church. We love you. Thank you.